What the book is saying is that we need to dream beyond the present moment and dream on a longer timescale. When you think about water is steadfast, water is persistent, water will work away on rock for thousands and thousands of years until it cuts.
That's Leanne Betasamosake Simpson. She is an award-winning and best-selling author, scholar, and musician talking about her new book, Theory of Water, Nishnaabe Maps to the Times Ahead. It's both a philosophical and deeply grounded look at our relationship with water and the lessons we can learn. I'm really thrilled to have Leanne as our guest on this episode of Explore, a Canadian Geographic podcast. Welcome to all you explorers out there, armchair and in motion. I'm your host, David McGuffin. As I'm recording this, it is 35 degrees at my back door in the shade. My studio is sweltering. My dog, Coco, is a puddle lying on the floor beside me. And, happily, there is a lake just down the hill from us. The water there is 15 degrees cooler than the air. That, right there, is a simple version of water is life. Leanne Betasamosake Simpson's theory of water goes much deeper, as does our conversation. Leanne is a self-described recovering academic, now working independently, with a focus on traditional and land-based Indigenous knowledge, dividing her time between Dene territories in the Arctic and Peterborough, Ontario. She is the author of 8 previous books, including A Short History of the Blockade and the novels Nupaming, The Cure for White Ladies, which was shortlisted for the Governor-General's Literary Award for Fiction and the Dublin Literary Prize. This Accident of Being Lost was a finalist for the Rogers Writers Trust Fiction Prize and the Trillium Book Award. Let's get to Leanne and me talking at the Ottawa Writers Festival. This is a live podcast event held at Library and Archives Canada. So Leanne Betasamosake Simpson, thank you so much for coming and doing this talk with us today. I've got a long list of your accomplishments, a best-selling author, award-winning author. I spent the morning prepping for this, listening to your music, which is absolutely gorgeous. So, but I think I'd rather hear from you. Can you describe who you are?
That's so awkward. I'm a mom. I live in Peterborough, Ontario. I'm a writer and an academic and a land-based educator and a musician. I don't fit in to genres and to disciplines very well. My day job is as a land-based educator at the Chinta Center for Research and Learning, which is based out of Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories. I'm a lifelong cross-country skier, so I've come to Ottawa to ski in the Gatineaus for most of my life.
Nice.
Yeah, and I'm very happy to be here with all of you.
Yeah, welcome. And welcome to all of you. Thank you so much. And it's great to be kicking off this festival, too. I didn't realize that was the honor we had when I showed up at MIO. This is the first one. But I think we're in Ottawa, and obviously we've just had an election. And I think one thing we can agree about this election is we all know this world is rapidly changing, and we're all, I think, looking for some sort of roadmap, no matter what your political stripe is. And the theory of water is a roadmap for sure, looking into our future. And it involves some deep thinking, but there's also a lot of things that are very relatable to it, too, which I really enjoyed. I want to start with cross-country skiing. Cross-country skiing was part of the inspiration for this book, and I'm just wondering if you can explain how that came about.
So I live in Peterborough, Ontario, and we have a really nice urban park called Jackson Creek Park. And during one of the pandemic winters, I volunteered to be one of the groomers for the ski trail. Mostly, I think, for a couple of reasons. There's nothing better than being the first skier on the trail after it's groomed. So I thought that would be cool. And because I work in the north, I wanted to keep my snowmobile skills up when I'm in the south so that I don't embarrass the Nishnaabe when I'm with the Dene. So I took on this volunteer sort of position of getting up in the morning and taking this very old skidoo slowly because you're grooming. So the idea is not to rip down the trail as fast as you can, but to go slow, to impact the snow. And I started to think about this idea of sintering, which Canadians know about because if you don't go out and shovel the snow after the snowstorm when it's light and fluffy. If you wait until the next day, you often have a more difficult job as the snow compacts. So I was thinking about this idea of sintering because it's important as for groomers. And I started to think about, investigate some of the science behind it, and this idea that a snowflake, when it's falling from the sky world and becomes landed, the first thing it does is it physically bonds to its neighboring snowflakes. So it finds a way of belonging. And I think the poet in me and the intellectual in me was like, this is a very interesting way of weaving yourself into the ecosystems and the environment that you're a part of without destroying the other snowflakes around you and without destroying yourself. And I thought, as a skier, those compacted trails that have sintered are the ski trails that the very dedicated people like myself can ski on when the snow has melted and there's still like a little tiny path.
Tell us, the word Nibi is important in this book. And what is Nibi? And you say we need all to be more like Nibi.
So Nibi is the Nishnaabe word for water. I'm Michi Saagiig Nishnaabeg. Michi Saagiig is where the word Mississauga comes from, and it means at the mouths of the rivers. So our part of the Nishnaabe territory is the north shore of Lake Ontario, so west of here. And I wanted to learn from water about what it's trying to teach us through its embodied practice. So if you think of the global water cycle, we've had the same amount of water on the planet since the beginning of the planet, and it cycles. It connects every living thing on the planet to each other in this sort of beautiful cycle of interconnection and interdependence. It has the ability to change forms from a solid to a liquid to a gas. And I wanted to pick up on something Dionne Brand had written in her epic Nomenclature. There's a line in that poem, what does it mean to believe in water? I also wanted to pick up on Rebecca Belmore's work, who is an Anishinaabe artist, who after the Oka crisis in 1990 made this big megaphone that she hauled across Canada, and people could go up to the megaphone and speak directly to the land. It's now in the National Gallery. And then a few years ago, she made a piece called Wave Sound, which were 4 hearing pieces that she installed on the shore of different bodies of water in national parks in Canada. And so it was so interesting to me that over this 20 years, she made this shift from speaking to the land to listening to water. So in this book, I was really interested in what we could learn by believing and by listening to water and by actually just being very present with something that's very ubiquitous, that we can turn on several taps in our houses and get clean water that's inside of us, that's outside of us, that connects us, that's our first home where we learn what it feels like to be safe. So Nibi for me in the book became more than just the word for water in Nishnaabe Moan. It became a kind of a stand-in for all of the different bodies of knowledge and meaning that I think water enacts.
So water obviously is the thread through all of this book. You'd mentioned Peterborough, and you taught for a brief time at Trent, and one of your mentors there was Doug Williams, who's former chief of Curve Lake. It's certainly within the Indigenous studies world is legendary as well. And for people who don't know Doug Williams, why was he important to you and to what you have in this book?
I knew Doug primarily as an elder at Curve Lake First Nation, and my ancestry, and I'm a member of Alderville First Nation, so those two communities are pretty related. I wanted to, after I got my PhD at the University of Manitoba, I wanted to move back to my homeland and learn directly from those elders, and I wanted to learn how to think with inside Anishinaabe thought. So Doug became a really important mentor to me, a friend. We spent nearly 3 decades just doing things on the land. We would go out hunting in the fall. We went hunting for geese and also deer and moose. We would In the winter, we would ice fish. We ran sugar bush for several years in March. Then we would do medicines and be back on the water in the spring. In the fall, we would do wild rice. He was a language speaker. He was a ceremonialist. But I think the part that really resonated with me, he was very funny. We had the same sense of humor, and he was a wonderful storyteller. So we would be able to talk kind of politics and story, language. And I think as a writer, he was somebody that was a provocateur through much of my work. So it was a really fantastic, one of the most important relationships of my life. And he passed away at 80 years old just before the book was in the works. So there is a component of the book where I'm dealing with grief, where one of the ways I'm coping with grief is by writing about him and thinking alongside him through the book, trying not to forget everything that he taught me. He had this fantastic body of knowledge from an Nishnaabe perspective because his two uncles, Madden and McConse, when they were little boys, they were very good at escaping the truant officer on the reserve. And so they didn't go to day school very much. They spent a lot of time in the woods. They spent a lot of time learning directly from their elders. So he carried this body of knowledge that was what those two little boys saved from being wiped out. And it was a very gentle, kind body of knowledge. And so I think that thread in the book is also there.
Yeah. And there's a strong connection to nature, to ceremony, which I think is a lot of what you're getting to in this book, is that in cities we've lost touch with a lot of that most of the time.
Yeah.
And it's a big question, but what is it that we need to do to bring that back to us?
I think it's different for each of us, but I think over the course of my professional life, taking young people out on the land with old people and facilitating or holding space for them to connect to each other and to connect to the land has been a really interesting process. I've been doing this for over 20 years, and now you have to really support young people in being without their phones, being without the internet, because that's such an important part of their social life and their emotional life. Learning how to work together when life is a lot of work, when there's a lot of wood to be chopped, there's a lot of dishes, you have to get water, the work of life can cause a lot of conflict for people who haven't done that kind of work before. So working out all of those things on the land in community has been a way of connecting, I think, in a deeper way to a way of life that is concerned with the plants and the animals and all of the living things that we're sharing time and space with.
And you're living this in your own life effectively too. I mean, you were in academia and you chose to leave that, and you're an independent academic, I guess now would be a way to describe that. Can you describe what that process was like for you? Leaving, like just how you've chosen to live your life, as opposed to you could have been a professor for the next 40 years. Yeah. And so why are you rolling your eyes?
My journey as a recovering academic. What's interesting in this book is that Dion Brand was one of the editors along with Lynn Henry. And the book that I sent Dion Brand was quite a bit more academic than this. And she just cut all of that out.
Yeah.
And I believed her. And so you folks don't have to wade through another one of those books from Leanne. I think that I never really wanted to be a professor.
Yeah.
I think that I wanted to spend time with elders on the land, but I recognized fairly early on that's not actually a job. So the PhD, I think, enabled me to figure out ways of doing that. When my kids were born, my son, I don't probably shouldn't be saying, he would be embarrassed, but he was like quite a firecracker of a baby, and he was not interested in daycare or being away from me for more than 35 seconds. I needed to find a way of being there for my kids without this kind of demand of the academy. And I wanted to have this life where the land, where Doug, where my kids were at the center. And so that actually worked out really well for a number of years. It doesn't work out that great financially, but it worked out great in terms of connection and fun and learning. And so I think the body of work I have comes directly from that. Had I been in the academy, I would have had a lot more pressure on me to be publishing in peer-reviewed journals and academic presses, and to do the kind of research that isn't just hanging out in the sugar bush for a month making maple syrup.
Yeah. So I was having dinner with my kids the other night, and as you do, we were talking about cultures and having a history of flood stories around the world. They all have flood stories. And so I told the story that Doug Williams told you, which they loved. And I'm just wondering if you can share that story and why that's important.
I think that is one of our Michi Saagiig Nishnaabeg origin stories that is the anchor of the book in a lot of ways. And he wrote it down in his book. And then I sort of went back and revisited it and have been retelling it with my own sort of bent, because it's a story about making worlds. And it's a story about making a new world out of the wreckage of an old one. And so I feel like it really resonates as we are sitting on this edge of becoming Trump's 51st state, and the tariffs and climate collapse and all of those things that we're facing. So Jouet Manado, who gets translated as the creator or God, but is in the language means the one that loves us unconditionally, has a dream about this world, this planet that we all share. And with dreams come responsibilities. And so Jouet Manado makes the world, and it's beautiful, and everything goes along fine for a period of time. And Doug called it Kina Bamadzawin, this big kindness. And then all of a sudden it gets into trouble and things start to die off, and their idea of the world isn't working anymore. And they feel really bothered and they're upset. And so they go back to the sky world, and there's another spirit, Gijagokwe, who is in conversation with Jouet Manado, kind of supporting them. And she decides, or she offers help, and she offers to go down to the world to see if she can figure it out. So Jouet Manado accepts the help. Gijagokwe goes down. She has a pretty difficult time, a lot of struggles. She has 2 kids, and they both die. So she's grieving. So they come back to the spirit world, and they don't know what to do. They're upset. They're both grieving. And in the meantime, Nibi, or water, floods the world and washes everything away. Gijagokwe decides to go back down. The snapping turtle, Chimakanuk, offers the back. She rests on the back of that turtle. The world is in a completely different physical form than the last time she was there. It's all water. The things that have been saved are the sun and the waters, and then some of the animals like loons and beavers and muskrats that can swim. And they start to gather on the back of this turtle. So they don't know what to do, but they know they need to start to meet the material needs of the community that's on the back of this turtle. So they need food, they need water, they need shelter. And so they start to take care of each other. Gijagokwe, while she's on the back of the turtle, notices a map that's still to this day on the back of the turtle. The 13 pieces of shell in the middle, and then the 28 pieces around the edge. And because her body cycles, she recognizes that as the missing ingredient. It's cycling and renewal. And she's now figured out why Jouet Manado's plan isn't working. And that's good, because Jouet Manado's was never meant to be perfect. Jouet Manado's job was unconditional love. So together with the animals, they take turns diving down to get the paw full of dirt. They finally get that with the muskrat, and they're able to make the world anew. And that's the world that we live in right now, with the cycling and the renewal. And Gijagakwe then retires to the sky world and becomes the moon, physically cycling, right, from full moon to new moon each month to remind us of that renewal and that cycling.
So it's quite hopeful, that story.
It's okay to be hopeful sometimes. I think I became interested in our origin stories because there is this practice of making a new world out of hopelessness and out of disaster. And there's always these ingredients. One of them is that no single person or community can do it on their own. It's always this collaborative effort. There's always a diversity of species and beings involved. It's always struggle. It's never easy. And when it's easy, it goes into ruins pretty quickly. So I think there's a lot of wisdom in those stories.
Yeah, you talk about communal, I think we're at a time now, especially in our southern neighbors, there's never been a more libertarian time, probably. Like we're all meant to make enough money so we don't have to rely on anyone, basically, is the goal. And I think you're saying that's why we have a problem, right? Is that?
And I think when you take a group of students out onto the land, you realize that really quickly.
Yeah.
That you're relying on each other. And so you have to have ways of solving conflict. You have to have things like accountability and consent. You have to be able to work through things together. And I think Nishnaabe thought has a lot to say. Individual self-determination is really important. It's important for communities to come around and support kids and youth in self-actualizing and figuring out their gifts and how they can contribute. But there's always this communal aspect that's almost the nest for that, which is very different than what you're talking about.
Looking at the election we just went through, I don't think there's a lot of evidence of much of that in either of those main platforms. How do we engage to get to that?
I was in Vancouver the night of the election. My book launch was during the election. So I could see people like checking the results on their phone and then like face palming. And I was like, oh no, what's happening? But Vancouver was also very sad because of the horrific violence out. Yeah. So it was an interesting evening. When I've been asked about the election, the book is not about the election at all. No. But I've had to think through that because of the week that I've been out in the world talking about the book. And I think what the book is saying is that we need to dream beyond the present moment and dream on a longer time scale. When you think about water is steadfast, water is persistent, water will work away on rock for thousands and thousands of years until it cuts an undercurrent or an arch or a chasm. And so I think this book is about thinking about the kind of world we want to live in, but the kind of world our grandchildren and their grandchildren are going to live in. And how do we plant the seeds and how do we organize ourselves differently beyond what the three parties are saying is possible, beyond what this present circumstances are telling is possible, and how do we build that world with the forms of life and the diversity that we're sharing time and space with on the back of this turtle.
There's many sort of great examples in the book of First Nations creating that change. Grass and Narrows is one that you've been actively involved in for a long time, and obviously that's a community that's had boil water advisories forever almost, and water pollution from pulp and paper mills and that. What have you learned from, or what can we all learn from Grassy Narrows?
I think one of the things about my Anishinaabe ancestors that I find powerful is every day they got up and they made their world. They weren't relying on infrastructure and institutions, but they got up and together they made their food systems, their spirituality, their economic system, their political system. And that process of coming together with your friends and neighbors and families and making something, for me, I see that as a site of knowledge generation. It's a place where you skill up. And so I think a lot of the forms of resistance that we see with the Wet'suwet'en against pipelines or Grassy Narrows blockading and trying to ensure their territory is intact is a form of community building. It's a form of knowledge generation, and it's embodying and building the alternative. And I think that's powerful work, that kind of generative refusal. I'm going to refuse the sort of capitalist infrastructure that I've inherited from colonialism, and I'm going to think differently and live differently.
Who are some inspiring people from that movement?
Judy Da Silva is somebody that I've known for a long time. And I think that she has dedicated her life to organizing to make sure that the land and her people recover from the mercury poisoning, but also have a homeland that's relatively intact.
You're talking about your editor who's focusing on the relatable stories. I found the eels an incredibly relatable story, and it wasn't one I knew. And I'm assuming at one point the Ottawa River was teeming with eels, and I don't think I've ever seen an eel. I grew up here. So tell us, it's a remarkable story, but tell us about the eels and why they matter in this.
So Doug and I were out, he used to call it chumming around on the land. Yeah. And he started talking about eels one day. We were around Stony Lake, north of Peterborough. And I was like, what are you talking about? There's no eels here.
Yeah.
And he said, like, he remembers when he was a kid, there were a couple of eels that got landlocked in Stony Lake, but that his uncles told him lots of stories about eels migrating from the Sargasso Sea through the St. Lawrence, through Lake Ontario, into the Kawarthas every summer. And they were a really important protein source for people. Their abundance was incredible.
Yeah.
They were also a messenger because their bodies and their health sort of told the story of the health of the ecosystems from the Sargasso Sea through the St. Lawrence all the way up through the migratory route and then back. So he thought of them as messengers and connectors.
Yeah.
That connected us to a very different environment than ours, but really reinforced this idea of interconnection and interdependence. And so Henry Lickers at Akwesasne has done some work on eels. And it was just a really interesting conversation because I had never seen one in my life. I had no idea of what the ecosystem has lost.
Yeah.
From a generation ago or 2 generations ago.
Yeah.
And so my baseline understanding of the place that I lived, of my homeland, was completely different.
Yeah. The thing that blew me away about that, too, is the Sargasso Sea is Bermuda, basically. It's
Bermuda.
A long way away.
Nothing about Bermuda or the Sargasso Sea, right? Yeah.
But that's a long way away. And what a remarkable journey. And yeah. And what do we lose?
I think that we lose that connection. I think my people were connected with a species that's pretty unique species that the homeland is near Bermuda in a saltwater body. So we're losing a respect and the relationship, and I think cherishing that kind of diversity.
And so it's principally damming, it's
lip rocks, damming, pollution.
So these are all big infrastructure things. Like how do we sort of unwind that in a way that's going to, I guess not, I don't know. How do we unwind that in a way that everyone can get around? Or
there are no answers to that question in a book. Deliberately, there are no answers because I think my approach in this book was come and think alongside me and alongside Doug and the eels and Dion and Rebecca, and let's figure it out. Let's all kind of figure out what our piece of this is. Let's generate some answers to this, because I don't think any one person, I think we have a lot of experience right now when one person rises to power and has a lot of answers.
Yeah.
So I think this is a different approach, and I see the book more as an invitation than a prescription. Yeah.
Just to step back then, to say, let's focus more on First Nations. You talk a lot about the need to maybe pull back from the system that's in place now. And within First Nations, you talk about needing to walk in 2 worlds, have a foot in the Western world, but also keep a foot in your traditions. Is that even too much, do you think?
I think that my piece of this has been to try and deepen my understanding of how my people thought, think, and how they lived in the world, how they knit themselves into these ecosystems in a way that brought forth more Minobamadzawin, more of the good life, more of a continuous rebirth. So I think that I had been taught through the Canadian public school system that Indians are not smart, that our stories are legends, that we don't have philosophy and ethics and politics and complicated literature. And I think my body of work is in response to that in some ways, where I see this tremendous amount of brilliance, particularly in embodied practice.
Yeah.
And so I'm interested in thinking through and imagining and putting energy into regenerating some of those systems as a way of transforming myself and my students and the people around me. And I think every time we come together on the land to engage in some sort of land-based practice, I was telling you backstage that I'm going to Inuvik on Monday to teach a course on hide tanning. There's going to be a whole bunch of knowledge that's about hide tanning that gets revitalized and regenerated with this group of students and elders. But we're going to learn a whole bunch of other things that, as the instructor, I should have on the course outline, but there's no way to predict what's going to come out. And I think that kind of learning is really meaningful to students. And I think it's meaningful to the world because there aren't very many spaces that you can go in and learn that kind of knowledge.
You talk in the book about a need to have a much more grassroots, much more communal sort of way of living together. But we also need to think on a global scale too. And how did those two work together?
I think for me, I was really concerned earlier on in my career. Like I wanted to come back to Michi Saagiig Nishnaabeg territory. I wanted to learn everything I could from Doug and from the land and through all these land-based practices. And I had a very insular sort of existence. And then that started to shift, I think, in Rehearsals for Living when I started to correspond and was writing those letters to Robin Maynard during the pandemic. And then in the last letter, Robin and I are starting to think of Indigenous Black solidarity and Indigenous feminism and Black feminism and how to expand our own rubric beyond the letters in the book. And that's when I start to think with Nibi and with water. And I started to realize, or I guess I just started to understand within Anishinaabe thought enough that the way that we set up the world is not a hierarchy. It's this living network of species and of ecosystems across time and space. And our responsibility is to weave ourselves or to knit ourselves into that network. And that then gives a very internationalist orientation. And it connects us to all of the other parts of the world. And that, I think, is a shift that you can see in my work through Rehearsals for Living to this book.
You mentioned Minobamadzawin just earlier, which means good life in Nishnaabe. But what does that mean beyond those words?
So Winona LaDuke talks about it as a continuous rebirth. And I think that's the best definition that I've heard of. The win on the end means a practice. Bamadzawin is the practice of life, and Mino is good. So what is a good practice of life? It's living in a way where there's a continuous rebirth. It also really decenters humans. So there's no human life. It's all life.
Which, I guess there's an argument to be made that since the Enlightenment in the West, certainly we've considered ourselves to be above everything. And I think what the climate crisis maybe is teaching us is it's not truth.
Yeah, and I think Anishinaabe people see the other species that we're sharing time and space with, the beavers, the fish, the birds, all of those are seen as nations and formations that have their own body of knowledge, that have their own specific ways of life that are different than Anishinaabe people, but that that relationality becomes a really important organizing force in our cosmos.
On the podcast, we've just done 2 interviews, one about beavers specifically, and they obviously almost got wiped out, and just but the impact they have, their return, and just how much water they bring back to the landscape. And just in terms of wildfires, where the beaver are, the wildfires have way less impact. But bison, buffalo as well.
So I think that I spent a lot of time thinking about beavers in the book, A Short History of the Blockade, and that's where I was trying to think through when Indigenous blockades through the lens of beavers. And in my culture, beaver is a teacher of knowledge. That's what we look for. And so the idea of a beaver dam, which was so important before colonialism set foot in Canada in terms of managing water and in terms of how the watersheds existed, the kinds of habitat that interaction made for other species, all of those kinds of things. So looking at blockades as a negation, we don't want to live in this way, and then something that's generative on the other side. This is the way that we want to live. And I think beavers are great teachers for that kind of thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm lucky enough to live on a lake, and there's one right in our bay, and just the presence of the beaver is reassuring. There's a legend on our lake, too, is that the beaver built a dam beside a person's dock across the lake. And this was the 1960s, so that guy got a hold of dynamite and tried to blow up the beaver dam, and the dock was obliterated, and the beaver dam remained.
That's a good legend.
So there's a lesson there, too, I think. Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. Renewal is woven through this book, and hope is woven through this book. And how is water those things for you?
It's interesting that you are seeing and experiencing hope in the book, because I think when I'm writing it, I'm very sad and I'm grieving. Yeah. And I don't think that I felt particularly hopeful. So it's not something that I was aware of when I was writing it.
Yeah.
And oftentimes, I think since the pandemic, it feels like it's just like one catastrophe after another.
Yeah.
So that's interesting that...
Do other people say that to you, or am I the only one?
No, other people have said that to me. But I think it comes from what Miriam Kaba calls hope as a discipline. Like, you have to foster. Hope is not just an emotion, it's a practice. It's being able to look out your window and see the opportunities for change and for transformation and for difference. And I think water holds such potential in terms of change and transformation. I had the opportunity in the Northwest Territories to be beside a lake while it was going through probably a 4-week process of melting. And there was amazing sounds. There was, as that layer of ice was almost like the skin of a drum.
Yeah.
There was massive transformations in terms of the species that were coming to the shore, and an incredible transformation from like a tiny water world under a whole bunch of ice, where there would have been a lot of fish living quite close together, to this expansive watery world. And that happens yearly. That's a transformation that the lake is going through yearly. So it made me realize that massive transformations are possible. They are happening all around us, like the eels, migratory species. And it made me look to the land as a teacher.
And you talk about shorelines, you mentioned, you talk a lot about those in the book. And why are shorelines important places in our world?
So Madeline Wheatung, who's from Curb Lake and who's a professor at Toronto Metropolitan University, has done a lot of work on shorelines and harm, and what are the kinds of things that we can learn at shorelines. And Sarah Hunt has also done a lot of work on the West Coast. And for me, shorelines are overlapping worlds. They're the land, the water, and the sky, and they're coming together. And so you've got fish, you've got birds, you've got animals, all along this kind of fractal overlapping space. And so for Anishinaabe people, this is where we would learn these skills of accountability. This is where we would learn skills of consent that matter so much when you're living in community with people. So I think that shorelines are a really interesting site of knowledge generation. They change throughout the course of the year. They're quite different in the winter. They change on a day. They're actually constantly in motion.
Yeah.
And I spent lots of time at the shore, thinking alongside the shore. I think Rebecca Belmore's wave sound pieces ask you to go to the shore and quiet yourself and listen.
Yeah. There are transition zones, effectively, and transitions what we need to do better and more of. And in that world, too, I loved your descriptions of you spent a lot of time in a canoe and just what the canoe brings to you in terms of perspective. And we're on one of the great canoe routes in North America, right here on the Ottawa. What is the canoe for you?
In our language, I just thought of this. We have nopaming, which is a book, but also means the bush, and then a word for shore. And that's because I think Anishinaabe people traveled by canoe and on the water. So the waterways were the highways, and they understood the land through that perspective. And that's a very different perspective when you're going on a long canoe trip and you're spending hours on floating on the water, and the shore is the edge of this other world. And so starting to flip it and see my territory from that perspective is super interesting. I remember being out with Doug one time, and he was talking about Oshawa being the place where Michi Saagiig people would cross the lake because it was close to where you used to be able to see the mist from Niagara Falls. So when they could see the mist from Niagara Falls, they knew that was the best route in terms of the currents in order to get across the lake in a canoe. And I was like, that's a fantastic level of knowledge.
Yeah.
Through embodied practice.
That's incredible. Yeah. There's so much in this book, and it is incredibly deep. And I'm wondering if we want to take questions from the audience.
Yeah, for sure.
Hi, thank you for coming to speak with us today, Leanne. I have a question about your experience as a land-based teacher, land-based pedagogy. When I was in university, I did some research on eco-literature and stuff like that, and I really appreciated it and I really enjoyed it. But I find that when I go out into the land, away from cities, I find that I'm very uncomfortable. I don't like being dirty. I feel uncomfortable in my own skin. I find it overwhelming. But I know, because of my appreciation of art about the land, and especially art by Indigenous thinkers, that it is a relationship that could be valuable to me. So I was wondering, what are some of the things you do with people and with kids who are uncomfortable on land? And how do you get them to start appreciating it?
That's a really great question. And I feel like good job. Not everyone is comfortable on the land. Not all Indigenous people are comfortable on the land. But I think there's still ways, and I think it's wonderful to connect through literature, through poetry, through music. I think in the city, you can still see the sunrise and the sunset. I think stars can be something that you can engage with. So I think it's important to realize we all don't have to love sleeping in a tent or love mosquitoes, but there are still ways that we can have a relationship with the different components that make up our planet and live differently. That's a great question. And I don't have the answer for you, but I would encourage you to find a way that you can relate to some of those cycles, those philosophies, those ethics, those species that you're also sharing time and space with in a way that makes sense to you and that brings out the best in you.
Great. Just up front.
Thank you very much for kicking off the festival with speaking about water. Touches me very personally because it's my medium. I swim in it, in open water. And I'm wondering if there is a dimension to your consideration of the role in water in our lives from within it. You talked about the shoreline and swimming in lakes, in rivers, in oceans, in the seas. And I do a lot of it solo. Not all of it, but a lot of it. Or there's a boat off there somewhere. And I'm always considering the shoreline and how far it's going out under the water. Is it going out as sand, as rocks, as dreadful weeds, or any of that? Does that come into your consideration of the water? And the one final thing, there's nothing more beautiful than swimming in a calm night when the sky is full of stars and the moon.
Mm-hmm. My mom is a swimmer, and she will swim in any temperature, and she will scream out, "It's pea soup," and that everybody needs to get in immediately. Swimming doesn't come in to this book a lot, but I think the book is an invitation to have a conversation about just that, because I think that's a really beautiful and powerful way that you relate to water, and that a lot of people are going to relate to water. The immersion, the shift in perspective, the things that you have to be attentive to when you're swimming. And I think that there's beautiful teachings in all of that. So I'm really glad that you shared that. Thank you.
Leanne Betasamosake Simpson, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Thanks for having me, Ottawa.
And thanks to all of you for listening. A little housekeeping note here. We're taking a short summer break, and we'll be back in mid-August for our annual favorite, the Canoe Series, this year featuring Adam Schultz again. He's on another solo canoe adventure in the Arctic. And we also have a former Canadian Geographic editor-in-chief, Dan Rubenstein, talking about his 2,000-kilometer paddleboard adventure from Ottawa to Montreal, down to New York City and Manhattan, and back via the Erie Canal and Toronto. It's an incredible story. I hope you all have a wonderful July, full of your own adventures in our natural world. Get out there and enjoy it. There's even free Parks Canada passes this summer. So until next time, when we'll explore again, I'm David McGuffin.
I think right now we're enjoying very much looking back at the Earth, and it's just a fantastic experience, and I just can't wait to get back and start telling people.
We left Simpson about June 10th with the fur brigade, consisting of a number of yacht boats, each manned by 10 voyageurs.
For us Inuit, it means that Inuit oral history is very strong.
And we flew low over every inch of the country that could be. We were hoping that he would fire at us.
I guess 160 dives or so. There are shrimp, fish swimming around outside. It's just fabulous here.
Well, I'm a first for Canada.